Tear down this wall.
Reagan's voice was his great gift.
Isn't it time that we tried something new?
Reagan could connect directly through a camera right into the living room.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
The Reagan Years, the Great Communicator. With anchor Jeff Greenfield.
We remember our country's 40th president, Ronald Wilson Reagan, through his words. In a time when dazzling visual imagery was changing the face of the way we communicate, it was Ronald Reagan's use of the simple spoken word that defined much of his political life. It was a speech that first made him a major national figure. It was his language that defined the meaning of a national triumph, or that gave us comfort at a time of national tragedy, that made complex international policy disputes understandable to millions. He spoke in clear, simple terms. Too simple, according to his critics, and he painted vivid pictures that sometimes reflected a reality of his own making. But he also had this great gift to breathe new life into cherished national beliefs about the American dream, about the nation's place in the world, about right and wrong. And while he may have spent years as an actor, his words reflected his deeply rooted conservative political beliefs to cut back the size and scope of government, to confront the Soviet Union with massive military hardware and a clear moral distinction between ideologies, and to celebrate traditional American values. These ideas were at the core of Reagan's presidency, a simple agenda that began more than 25 years earlier when Ronald Reagan, the actor, left the bright lights of Hollywood to pursue another role, a role of a lifetime. We'll begin in just a moment.
CNN.
Before he became the great communicator, Ronald Reagan was a pretty good actor, sometimes a leading man, more often the leading man's best friend. But in the mid-1950s, he began playing to a different audience, not one sitting in a darkened theater, but people on assembly lines, in boardrooms and banquet halls.
The season's most glittering movie premiere, the Hollywood opening of The Chalk Garden, sees a host of celebrities, including Ronald Reagan and his wife.
After 27 years on the big screen, with 53 movies to his credit,
We're right on the edge of the Japanese shipping lane, Don. Better take those frogmen out through the escape trunk. Yes, sir.
Ronald Reagan's movie career was in eclipse.
Where's the rest of me?
So in 1954, Reagan left acting for his new job,
Good evening. Tonight,
a public speaking position with the General Electric Corporation.
you know, to live better, you've got to...
Live better electrically.
It took Reagan all across the country, promoting GE products and attempting to boost morale for its thousands of employees.
Reagan got out on the road. He got away from Hollywood, and he went to these plants all around the country, which required him to travel for 10 weeks a year, I think it was. GE worked him very hard. One of the GE people said we wanted a Cadillac at Chevrolet prices.
From General Electric and from my family and myself, a Merry, Merry Christmas.
And I think that probably what Reagan did was he articulated what people felt. And it fit at that moment. And here was the Hollywood actor with all the presence and the stagecraft that it took. He stated in simple terms, eloquent terms, to be honest with you, what was in the hearts of people.
But after 8 years, a full 2 of them on the road, visiting every one of GE's 135 plants and 250,000 employees, Reagan and General Electric went their separate ways. Reagan's GE experience turned out to be an invaluable political asset.
It sort of sold America, not just GE. This was really the training that no one but Reagan really ever had.
Next witness, Mr. Ronald Reagan.
Reagan was no stranger to political life. He'd been president of the Screen Actors Guild.
I accept the nomination.
Had campaigned for Harry Truman in '48, for Nixon in '60. But it was as a spokesman for Barry Goldwater in 1964 that Reagan first gained attention as a powerful political voice on behalf of a candidate headed for an historic defeat.
He got into politics when his message was a lonely message. You'll recall that the time he made his national political debut was during the Goldwater campaign. That was a lonely place to be at that time. If you were playing the odds for the future, you didn't play them with that campaign.
Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States.
October 27, 1964. From Los Angeles, Ronald Reagan delivers a televised appeal on behalf of Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign. It turned out to be the first step on his own journey to the White House.
Mr. Reagan.
Thank you.
Reagan delivered not just an endorsement, but a stern warning about the country's course.
The full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose.
What made it so good is the analogies he used all through it, just struck home with every, Irishman in any bar in America at the time. So it was his ability to take those overriding issues of the time and to demonstrate them in a manner that people said, I agree with that.
Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation.
Everything with Reagan was, we have a choice, and it's not between left and right, but between up and down, down into the dependency of the welfare state and the nanny state and big government, or up into freedom.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. Thank you very much.
With one speech, which to this day has been labeled simply the speech in Reagan's repertoire, the GOP had found itself a new hero. Goldwater lost the election to Lyndon Johnson that year in a landslide that was to be post-war liberalism's high watermark. But the political spotlight quickly shifted to the handsome and articulate Hollywood celebrity turned rookie politician, Ronald Reagan.
Reagan could connect directly through a camera right into the living room. He understood how to do that, and because he felt comfortable. And we haven't had anybody that effective speaking through a medium since Franklin Roosevelt, who spoke through radio and could do much the same thing.
In 1966, Reagan made a run for governor of California. He won by nearly 1 million votes.
Governor Reagan, I now declare you to be duly installed as governor of the state of California.
And instantly became a major figure on the national stage.
I'll try very hard. I think it is needed in today's world.
The conservatives' man on horseback. In 1974, after governor of California, Reagan left. 2 years later, he challenged President Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. He lost every one of the early primaries and was on the verge of dropping out when, in North Carolina, he turned to his favorite weapon, the spoken word, delivering a half-hour address on statewide television about foreign policy. Reagan won that primary and a string of later contests, and came within a whisker of unseating Ford at the Republican convention in Kansas City.
We're all tremendously pleased and honored to have Ron Reagan and Nancy Reagan come down.
Was this ability of his to connect with people always something that was a key to him, or did it ripen and grow as he got better?
It was always there. The two things that were always there with Reagan were the ability to connect and the optimism.
I believe the Republican Party has a platform that is a banner of bold, unmistakable colors with no pale pastel shades.
It was Reagan's determined pursuit of that optimism that brought him back to New Hampshire in 1980. His opponent, Texan George Bush, had upset Reagan in the Iowa caucuses. In New Hampshire, Bush insisted on squaring off with Reagan for a one-on-one debate in the Granite State. Reagan's advisors thought it was in their candidate's best interest to invite the other four candidates to the debate. The Bush camp thought otherwise. The debate was about to proceed when the moderator of the night's activities decided to spontaneously turn off Ronald Reagan's microphone.
Make an announcement
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute? Is this on? Mr. Green,
Did you turn that microphone
you
off,
asked for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
It was a simple phrase, one Reagan had in fact borrowed from a movie.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Grant Matthews. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't take any more of this. Don't you shut me off. I'm paying for this broadcast.
But with that one simple phrase, Reagan locked up the New Hampshire primary and was on a glide path to the Republican presidential nomination.
I had a dream just the other night. I dreamed that Jimmy Carter asked me why I wanted his job. And I told him I didn't want his job. I want to be president.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
By fall, most of the polls were showing a very close election, one that could come down to the single debate between Reagan and President Carter in Cleveland, Ohio.
Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again. When I opposed Medicare...
Remember that the 1980 election was played out against a backdrop of economic gray skies.
Have you found a job? No, we've been to 17 states and ain't nothing.
And Reagan used his closing debate statement to deliver a now classic crystallization of America's discontent.
Next Tuesday is Election Day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago?
Reagan's message hit home.
We were about 10 days out in 1980, and I said, from the election, and I said, Governor, you're going to win this thing. And he didn't like to hear that. He was very superstitious. And no, we don't talk about that. I said, well, I'm going to tell you anyway. You're going to win this thing, and your whole life's going to change. He says, what do you mean? I said, well, at 7 o'clock in the morning, a guy's going to show up with a bunch of pieces of paper from NSC, National Security Council, and give you the horror stories of everything that happened in the last overnight around the world. And he says, what? I said, 7 o'clock. He says, well, they're going to wait till 9. And that just says it. That's Ronald Reagan.
He defeated Carter, capturing 51% of the popular vote, 10 points more than the incumbent president.
He seemed to be a bit of a cowboy. People weren't quite so sure how dangerous is this fellow going to be. And he had bold programs. Reagan made it clear he did not want to govern in pastels. He wanted to govern with bold colors.
When we return, the cowboy heads for Washington. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan was sworn in as the country's 40th president of the United States. Beyond any one change in policy, Reagan's biggest challenge was a restoration of national confidence, battered by years of war, domestic violence, the trauma of Watergate, and economic drift. And on the other side of the world, in Tehran, Iran, the fate of American hostages, a symbol of American impotence, remained unclear. This was President Reagan's first chance to communicate a sense of confidence and assurance to the nation.
Governor, are you prepared to take the constitutional oath?
I am. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That was quite a day. It was Number one, it was almost a spring day up on the January 20th. And he changed the swearing in to the west side so he could look down the mall. The sun was out, it was warm, people took their coats off.
I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope.
The Iranian hostage thing was right up to the edge.
In about 90 minutes, the 52 Americans who even 12 hours ago were hostages of the Iranian government should be landing at Frankfurt, West Germany, free men and women.
Jimmy Carter had spent 2 nights without sleep trying to negotiate that. It came up, and there was Reagan who could reap the benefits of really basically Carter's work, but also I think part of it was the realization by the Iranians that this was a new man. This was a different sort of person.
It could not have been a better symbol for a new leader. At almost the exact moment he was assuming power, the American hostages in Iran were being freed.
Anything to say to America? Well, just hello, and thank God it's all over.
There was a perceived weakness on the part of the American people in Jimmy Carter, who was a much more ineffectual president than he is a post-president. Stagflation was taking off. America was getting kicked around the world. And people had a sense, we need a strong person to come in here. Somebody has to pick up the reins and govern this country. And Reagan came in on a white horse.
No arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors.
He was president after a period of perceived humiliation. We had lost in Vietnam. Afghanistan had been occupied under the Carter administration. There were hostages in Iran. And this message of hope and American resurgence, in which we could prevail and not just endure, those were very significant for the period.
First of all, the president is safe. We are told that shots were fired at his party as he left the hotel.
That sunny Reagan optimism was almost snuffed out just 77 days into office. On March 31st, 1981, Reagan was shot by John Hinckley outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. Permanently injured in the assassination attempt was Reagan's press secretary, James Brady.
You actually see the most genuine Reagan is when he's shot. Bullet was was an inch from his heart. The bullet was very close. We didn't know how close he'd come to dying. And all this stuff you got out of Reagan, to Nancy, honey, I forgot to duck, to the doctors, I hope you're all Republicans. This is Reagan. Reagan faced personal danger with wisecracks. He used humor. Humor was his great communication tool.
Less than a month after the attempt on his life, Ronald Reagan addressed a joint session of Congress, beginning on a note of jaunty good humor.
Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas. And he added a postscript. P.S. If you have to make a speech in your pajamas, I warned you.
But Reagan's central message was about the health of the American economy, an often numbingly complex concern that he diagnosed in simple, powerful language.
Because of the extent of our economy's sickness, we know that the cure will not come quickly, and that even with our package, progress will come in inches and feet, not in miles. But to fail to act will delay even longer and more painfully the cure which must come. And that cure begins with the federal budget. Isn't it time that we tried something new?
I remember watching that speech and going, you don't ask anything more of a line in a speech.
But he did that over and over. There you go again. He did this one-liner.
that has this incredible cogency and this incredible persuasiveness to the simplest of us. You know, he had that gift.
And nowhere did Reagan use this gift more than in defining, with black and white simplicity, the struggle between the West and communism. He spoke not as a geopolitical strategist, but as a moral leader.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral, not immoral. And we operate on a different set of standards. I think when you do business with them, even at a détente, you keep that in mind.
Well, you know, I wasn't sure it was a good idea to say it. On the other hand, it was true. And the fact that he wasn't afraid to call a spade was, I think, an important element. It didn't seem to me that this was something that the Soviet leaders should have taken that much. They had been calling us imperialists and warmongers for decades.
In the summer of 1981, Reagan faced his first real test as chief executive. On August 3rd, 13,000 members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO, walked off their jobs, creating potential havoc in the skies.
It was in the early weeks. Reagan walked out of the Oval Office, a jolly fellow, just a little somber, but still Reagan, you know, a little bit of a smile on his lip, fired the air controllers. It stunned me, stunned everybody there.
I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
This quick response and decisive move proved that Reagan was a strong leader, setting the tone quickly in Washington and beyond.
Must civilization perish in a hail of fiery atoms? Must freedom wither in a quiet, deadening accommodation with totalitarian evil?
On June 6, 1982, President Reagan addressed Great Britain's House of Commons with a speech that resonated behind the walls of the Soviet Empire.
We maintain this strength in the hope it will never be used. For the ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas.
As president, Reagan sometimes shunned traditional diplomatic language in speaking of the West's adversary. In the spring of 1983, Reagan flew to Orlando, Florida to meet with the National Association of Evangelicals. The words he chose to use about the Soviets echoed like thunder.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
They were the ones who were the totalitarians. They were the ones that had a philosophy that, they said, with or without their help, was going to prevail throughout the world. We were destined for the dustbin of history. Well, to have a president who said, hey, you know, that's not right. It's the other way around.
The speeches were a big part of how he began to undermine the self-confidence of the Soviet regime and making the moral case against Soviet communism as evil.
But nothing would symbolize Reagan's unbounded faith in military technology than his embrace of the Strategic Defense Initiative, known sometimes as Star Wars.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The Cold War was still going on. The Soviet Union was still a threat. Terrorism, the spy who came in from the cold was out there. The back alleys were dangerous in the world. We had these little firefights like in Nicaragua, and the Middle East was in constant turmoil. I think, once again, Reagan just said, we've got to be strong.
Whatever Reagan's desire to protect the American people from a nuclear attack, his national security initiative was viewed by many military experts as, at best, a fantasy. It was far from the only time when Reagan's unshakable belief in what he was saying blurred the line between reality and imagination. So the idea that he sometimes believed things that weren't is a part of who he is.
It's not just that he believed things that weren't. he believed things the way he wanted them to be.
But on September 1st, 1983, Reagan got a heavy dose of reality when a Korean Airlines jumbo jet, KAL Flight 007, filled with 269 people, including 61 Americans, drifted into Soviet airspace and was shot down by a Soviet fighter.
This one came up quite unexpectedly. Actually, that occurred when I was in Prague. I was still ambassador to Czechoslovakia. I immediately flew back to Washington. But the first thing was he's going to address the nation, write a speech. He was to give it the next day, and it didn't come out of his office. It didn't come out of his office. And finally, literally minutes before he was to give it, we were given a copy that he had written out in hand on long legal pads, every bit of it.
If the massacre and their subsequent conduct is intended to intimidate, they have failed in their purpose.
And Reagan was angry. He was really angry.
From every corner of the globe, the word is defiance in the face of this unspeakable act, and defiance of the system which excuses it and tries to cover it up.
He called it a crime against humanity. But what's interesting is at the same time, he sided with the moderates in his administration, notably George Shultz, and said we've got to keep communications open with the Soviet Union.
If Reagan's celebration of a future technology such as Star Wars was dubious, there was no mistaking the power of his celebration of the past. In June of 1984, Reagan went to Normandy for the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion that marked the beginning of the end of World War II. The words he used brought tears even to the eyes of the most jaded of journalists.
These are the boys of Puente Hope. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war.
In our next half hour, Ronald Reagan's second term, from the shining city on the hill to the dark day of the Challenger disaster, and negotiating an end to the Cold War.
The Reagan Years, The Great Communicator, with anchor Jeff Greenfield.
In 1984, Republican campaign ads were telling us it was morning in America. Reagan-Bush buttons that year read, "Bringing America back, prouder, stronger, better." And when the great communicator himself took up the theme, the Democrats really didn't have much of a chance.
We proclaimed a dream of an America that would be a shining city on a hill. We said we would once again be respected throughout the world, and we are. We said we would restore our ability to protect our freedom on land, sea, and in the air, and we have. We bring to the American citizens in this election year a record of accomplishment and the promise of continuation. We came together in a national crusade to make America great again and to make a new beginning. Well, now it's all coming together. With our beloved nation at peace, we're in the midst of a springtime of hope for America. Greatness lies ahead of us.
Reagan's words sent a chilling reminder to the Democrats that he was a man of unique ability in delivering a political message, an ability appreciated by New York Governor Mario Cuomo, who had electrified the Democratic convention with his keynote speech.
10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy.
The Democrats were down because Reagan was high. They were eager. I was the first speaker at the convention. Reagan's fantastic capacity for making you feel good about America, morning in America, the shining city on a hill. How are we going to deal with that?
There's another part to the shining city, the part where some people can't pay their mortgages, and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate.
And they think it was
Reagan began the general election with a wide lead over former Vice President Walter Mondale. But that lead seemed a bit shaky after Reagan's shaky performance in their first debate.
And hopefully an elimination of nuclear weapons.
But in the second debate, a classic Reagan quip all but swept the age issue aside.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan went on to a landslide victory over Mondale, winning 49 states, receiving 525 electoral votes to Mondale's 13.
I think that's just been arranged.
He could be low and folksy and funny. He could be high and presidential. He could go from cracking one joke after another to bringing a tear to your eye. I suppose if I had to sum it up in one word, I would say skilled. He was a highly skilled speaker. And that was no accident. He had a great deal of native ability.
With Reagan's re-election behind him, it was back to business. None more significant than America's relations with the Soviet Union. By 1985, a new man was in control of the Soviet Empire, Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan very much wanted to meet him, especially after word came in from his close ally, Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, that the Soviet leader was, quote, a man we can do business with. After 8 months of correspondence, the two world leaders met for the first time in Geneva.
They met for hours together. They got along. They got great respect. And so I asked Reagan one time, I said, Mr. President, you weren't a detail man, and Gorbachev had all those facts and figures. We thought he'd humiliate you, and instead you became great friends. You spent hours together. Tell me, how'd that come about? How Office really got that kind of that mischievous twinkle in his eye, and he said, he said, he didn't know any of that stuff either.
And here comes President Reagan now.
What you saw was what he was actually like. That was the authentic Reagan. And the experience you would get watching him on television was exactly the same as you would get if you were in an audience, standing behind him on the podium as a speechwriter, or meeting him, a stranger off the street, meeting him. It was exactly the same.
I think, quite honestly, he is really the first of the true television presidents.
General Secretary Gorbachev, we ask you to join us in getting the job done, as I'm sure you will. Thank you.
While the meeting at Geneva was more historical than practical, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to meet again. And they did in Reykjavik, Iceland.
We're not through.
Where the leaders tried and failed to reach a nuclear arms agreement of historic proportions.
While we parted company with this American offer still on the table, we're closer than ever before to agreements that could lead to a safer world without nuclear weapons.
While there was no agreement at Reykjavik, Reagan and Gorbachev did establish a foundation that would stick for the remaining years of Reagan's presidency.
He brought about a change in atmosphere and a change in the environment. And after all, one should judge a president by the consequences of his actions, and they were significant.
Nobody really imagined we could actually end the Cold War, but we could at least begin moving toward an end to it.
Back home, Reagan and his advisors had been devising one of the most comprehensive tax reform acts of his presidency.
We call it America's tax plan because it will reduce tax burdens on the working people of this country.
Government too big, too expensive, taking too much money from the people, too intrusive, too much regulation.
The one thing he would not do is raise the income tax rates. Those were sacrosanct. And it showed to me, and I think to anybody who knew what was going on, that he absolutely understood the principles of supply-side economics.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the...
Barely a year into his second term, Reagan found himself faced with the kind of unexpected tragedy that can haunt a presidency, in this case, one that exploded out of the sky.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The flight lasted only 73 seconds. All 7 on board were killed.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
That night, Reagan became not the chief executive, but the chief consoler, the first mourner.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
What he saw the president doing was providing leadership in times of crisis, providing inspiration. And he felt that the fact that he had been trained as an actor, had worked as an actor, helped him to do that.
Several months later, Reagan was faced with a very different challenge when it was revealed that his administration had secretly sold U.S. weapons to Iran in order to obtain the release of several Americans held hostage in the Middle East. That, despite a clear embargo on such sales. But there was more. Funds from those arms sales had been diverted to support the Contra military activities in Nicaragua, despite a clear congressional ban on such efforts. It was an embarrassment to Reagan personally and to his credibility. He had constantly asserted that the United States would never negotiate with terrorists. The words he used in his speech on the issue were a clear acceptance of his own responsibility.
As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities.
It was the first time that I saw him shaken. And to some extent, we were, rather than writing, each of us would write 3 or 4 speeches a week. And suddenly he was giving less speeches.
As disappointed as I may be in some who served me, I am still the one who must answer to the American people for this behavior. And as personally distasteful as I find secret bank accounts and diverted funds, well, as the Navy would say, this happened on my watch.
I don't think Ronald Reagan ever fully recovered from Iran-Contra. Something snapped with him with his relationship with the people.
You stand up, please, and let me administer oath.
They found that the administration was saying one thing publicly and doing another thing privately.
I do.
And it damaged his relationship. And those who were responsible for Iran-Contra hurt Ronald Reagan badly.
Reagan emerged from the shadow of Iran-Contra with a 10-day tour of Europe. That trip provided one of the most enduring images of his presidency, as he stood before Germany's Brandenburg Gate, literally in the shadow of the Berlin Wall.
I was assigned to write that speech. The guidance I was given in total was, he'll stand in front of the Brandenburg Gate. We expected an audience of about 10,000 people. He should speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and it should be about foreign affairs, period.
We come to Berlin, we American presidents, because it's our duty to speak in this place of freedom. But I must confess, we're drawn here by other things as well, by the feeling of history in this city, more than 500 years older than our own nation.
If you want to know the difference between, the freedom of the West and what they had in the Soviet side, then that wall was what you needed to see.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
I've heard that speech 100 times, and I played it, and it still gives me a little bit of chill.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I think that's his best moment.
By December of that year, the apostle of hardline policy, the man who coined the term evil empire, met his Soviet counterpart in an historic U.S.-Soviet summit and signed the bilateral agreement.
It was a simple proposal, one might say disarmingly simple.
The treaty directed the elimination of intermediate and shorter-range missiles targeted at their respective countries. This reduction of arms had been a mission, he told the General Assembly, maybe even an obsession of Reagan's from his first days as president.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
Clare Boothe Luce, the playwright and writer, is famous for having said that history has time for only one sentence for each great figure. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Winston Churchill saved England from Hitler. There's no doubt in my mind that Ronald Reagan's sentence will be, he won the Cold War.
Next, Ronald Reagan says farewell and looks to the future. We'll consider his legacy when we return. Throughout his presidency, Ronald Reagan often spoke of simpler times, traditional values, figures from America's past. But the oldest man ever to serve as president also spoke of the future, and in always optimistic terms, always asserting that America's best days lay ahead. In his farewell address, he tried to sum up what he had tried to do.
I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do.
When he made that speech, Reagan had been at the center of political life for more than 20 years.
So help me God.
Yet he never talked as if he were a career politician.
And in all of that time, I won a nickname, the Great Communicator. But I never thought it was my style or the words I used that made a difference. It was the content. I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full bloom from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation, from our experience, our wisdom, and our belief in the principles that have guided us for 2 centuries.
Author Lou Cannon often said that Ronald Reagan was a salesman who could convince himself of almost anything. His most convincing act of self-conviction was his belief that he was not really a politician at all, but simply an actor on loan from Hollywood who had entered politics because he wanted to restrain the power of an increasingly intrusive government.
He had this great optimism. What people were seeing in Reagan, I think, always as a communicator, I can't get Gary Wills' phrase out of my mind that he played the heartwarming role of himself, you know, in the movies. They were seeing Reagan.
For a man with an abiding distrust of big government, Reagan left the White House with a decidedly mixed legacy. The national debt had nearly tripled. There had been no reduction in the federal budget or in the tax burden the average American bore. His champions say, though, that may have disguised the changes that did, in fact, begin on his watch.
The things he talked about, the majority of the public agreed with him during this period of time. He believed it before he ran. He believed it when he was in office. He believed it afterwards.
Ronald Reagan, in the space of 8 years, turned it all around. He set in place the conditions for an economic expansion that we're still experiencing today.
When he left the Oval Office for the last time, on that morning, he reached in his pocket and he pulled out this card that is used for the football. It was the card you used to unlock the nuclear codes with the guy with the code bag that was with him all the time. And he carried this, and he pulled it out and he looked at it and looked around and he said, "What do I do with this?" It was half a dozen words. It was a speech at that grand moment. And I think much of his life was from place to place like that. And I think he thought it out every time.
I think they're going to remember him as the person who restored hope and confidence to a country when it was really troubled.
You know how good he was? He could do it without words. He could do it with a nod. He could do it with a gesture.
It's true.
Well, you know, I mean, it's just wonderful.
We've done our part. And as I walk off into the city streets, a final word to the men and women of the Reagan Revolution, the men and women across America who for 8 years did the work that brought America back. My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Ronald Reagan's last words to the country he served and loved were written in November 1994. In the letter announcing he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, the former president wrote, "I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends. May God always bless you. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan." I'm Jeff Greenfield. Good night.
Next Sunday, the story of Ronald Reagan from childhood to the presidency through exclusive photography from the pages of Life magazine. The Reagan Years, a life in pictures. Next Sunday, 10 Eastern on CNN.